Hello, everybody, and welcome on into Conversations with Authors. It's lovely to see you all here today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. While everybody is pouring in, allow me to introduce myself. I am just your producer for the day, but I would like to take the time to introduce our moderator. So, welcome to a Conversations with Authors special panel event, Immigration in America. Before we get to our speakers and to our moderator properly, allow me to welcome you back to Conversations with Authors, to our Conversations with Authors series. If you've seen one of these events before, well then, welcome back. We're glad to see you again. And if you are new here, then Book Passage is an independently run group of bookstores out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run talks just like these all throughout the week, both in person, sometimes at our stores, but mostly online on YouTube. And as we are now streaming on YouTube, and will continue to do so in the future, we would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel down below. It, one, helps us know that we're doing things that you like, and two, helps us to appease the grand YouTube overlords so that our good, excellent book talk content gets out to the rest of the world. It's completely free to you. It helps us out. And if you click the little bell next to the subscribe button, it lets you know every time we go live with a book talk or a panel event or any other pre-recorded author content as we post from time to time. If you'd like to check out upcoming events or like the idea of an email newsletter, which we put out every Monday, you can find them both at bookpassage.com. On the right-hand side of the screen, there's a little email thing. And if you'd like to check out any of the speakers' books or anything else that happens to be mentioned here tonight, you can find all of them on the event page at bookpassage.com. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat just to the right or just below the screen you're watching on right now. It is the only way to get your questions to the speakers. I will make sure if you write them to patch them on over, and we'll see which of them they find interesting and want to answer. Now, allow me to introduce our moderator tonight, Paula Farmer, who, in addition to being a Book Passage event host, curates special panel events just like these for Book Passage that focuses on timely social and political issues such as race in America, pride in America, and immigration in America. In 2019, she co-founded and began chairing the Mosaic Committee for the California Independent Booksellers Association, and earlier this year, she was selected for the DEI Committee for the American Booksellers Association. Alrighty, everybody, this is where I get off. We can all see Paula on the screen right now. Hello, Paula.
Hi, thank you so much, Nick, and I'm so excited today. There's been two major changes since the last Immigration in America panel that was exactly just about 2 years ago today. And the first and obvious is that we have a new president, a new administration. And although it is riddled with challenges, issues, and criticisms regarding immigration issues, our anxiety levels were a little bit more heightened under the Trump administration and his anti-immigrant advisor, Stephen Miller, in charge. Secondly, the next obvious change has been, a worldwide pandemic that we've come out pretty much. We're not completely on the other side, but we're doing a little bit better. But because of it, most of the Book Passage events and certainly these panel events have pivoted to virtual online, and today's is no exception, obviously. And that first in person, you kind of can't take away that audience and author interaction. There's nothing like that three-dimensionality of in person, but it's not lost on me the benefits of doing this virtually. The fact that we either live and or in the recording can reach so many, many more people, and we can do that worldwide. So we're really excited about that prospect. And speaking of pandemic, my first panelist I'd like to introduce, Cesar Garcia Hernandez. I don't know if he realizes this, but he was officially, absolutely the last author we had before the shutdown last year. And I remember that vividly because I was his host. And I was a little bit mortified at the lack of turnout. Of course, now in hindsight, we realize why that was happening as it was getting closer. And Cesar was such a trooper, giving a great presentation to, I think, like 4 or 5 people, as if there were 50 or 100 people in the room. And I told him then that when we get past all of this, you're coming back one way or another. And sure enough, here he is. He was one of the first ones I thought of and reached out to. Cesar is a professor at the University of Denver, Stern College of Law. He is a leading scholar on immigration and detention, often writing on the subject for publications such as the New York Times and The Guardian. The details of these topics that Cesar excels in is on his website called crimigation.com, and his book, Migrating to Prison, is definitely details all this information. We have plenty of his books at Book Passage, San Francisco and Corte Madera, online by the phone. Feel free to call and order your copy. And thank you so much, Cesar, for coming again. And next up is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. Dunbar Ortiz is the winner of the 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize and is the author and editor of many books, including An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And our featured book tonight, Not a Nation of Immigrants. Roxanne was already on my radar before I talked to a book industry colleague, Calvin Crosby. But after I talked to him, I knew I had to get her for this panel, because I'm telling you, he was just nuts over your book. He said it was changing the way he was thinking and living, and he couldn't stop talking to people about Not a Nation of Immigrants. And so once he said that, I immediately started reading the book and had to get Roxanne on. Thank you so much for coming. And next is Syed Masood. He grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, a first-generation immigrant twice over. He's going to have to explain that to me. He has been a citizen of 3 different countries and 9 different cities. He currently lives in Sacramento, California, where he's practicing attorney, having just recently finished reading and listening to the journey, literally, of the lives of the characters of your most recent book, Bad Muslim Discount. Anwar, Zua, Azar are fresh on my mind. And not least of which are the parents. They bring the charm and the humor, and they help drive in kind of the issues, the pressures on young immigrants in particular, and first generation in adjusting to a new world, and the added pressure of having to maybe excel even more for parents that expect, who have invested so much and sacrificed so much. I'm so expecting that this is one of your first few books, but that there's going to be many, many more. I know we've been advertising and saying that we have that 4th panelist, Jay Caspian Kang. And if he comes, and as soon as he comes, we'll bring him on. But for now, it's the 4 of us. And I think that's more than enough, although I would love to see Jay join us. Thank you all for doing this and joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Oh yeah, for sure. I always like to start off encouraging among us, and then obviously the audience that we want to join in via chat, that this is a civil discourse. I know it can be kind of a hot button topic of immigration and all the issues that surround it, but we're going to have a civil discourse and welcome questions between ourselves and others in the audience. I also like to start off giving my panelists specific questions to their expertise before we get into broader topics that all of them can address if they so choose to. Why don't we also start off with kind of more of a historical context of things? With that, I'm going to first give it to Roxanne. And I think your book obviously delves into the history of indigenous people in the United States, but also obviously immigrants and policies and issues for the United States with all of that. But your title is almost, it kind of stops you in your tracks because you expect it to be a nation of immigrants, but you have it not a nation of immigrants. And in that, I think, is a history lesson in itself. So with that, Roxanne, can you please explain your title?
Yes, and the subtitle, of course, is very important.
Very important.
Yeah, it's Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. It's certainly not an anti-immigrant text. I've been working, I don't know, since I was in graduate school in Los Angeles with immigrant rights. So a nation of immigrants, though, is it's rhetoric that avoids the dynamic of settler colonialism and plays a role that is really essential to settler colonial nation state projects such as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the political project of the settler to create and fortify the colonial nation state becomes obscured by the non-political project of the immigrant who merely seeks to take advantage of what the state allows every citizen. So settlers are really unique migrants made by conquest, not by immigration. And settlers are founders of political orders and carry their sovereignty with them. Whereas immigrants face a political order that is already constituted, and immigrants can certainly be individually co-opted within the settler colonial society, and often are, but they do not enjoy inherent rights and are characterized by a defining lack of sovereign entitlement. So immigrants and refugees to the United States have the option to resist becoming settlers, although in most cases, they do not know the history of the United States or the political reality of the settler state. So a nation of immigrants was created, the phrase was created in 1958 by John F. Kennedy when he was senator and going to run for president. So I think it was a way of creating a new way of thinking about immigrants that would allow him, as a child of immigrants and a Catholic, neither of which had ever been elected to the presidency. Everyone had been settlers or descendants of settlers. So it's a very, it caught on as simply a truism, especially by liberals, not so much by the right wing, of course, who dislike and oppose immigration.
Yeah, and have a kind of a history, a long history with that seemed to crescendo during the Trump administration. You also, because of the subtitle, included in that, as you mentioned, are indigenous people in your book. But a lot of times people don't think in terms of indigenous people in any topic related to immigrants, but I like how you kind of tie it in, and it's a very important chapter in your book, and how things that happened, how indigenous people were and are treated does end up happening and has happened to immigrants. And I just was hoping that you could kind of expand on that.
Yeah, well, indigenous peoples had, of course, the whole continent, 350 different nations and communities. And what settler colonialism over, well, the taking of the 13 colonies took quite a long time, took a century, because the Native people resisted. And then when the United States was formed, it went all out war. Even during the War of Independence, they were mainly fighting on the periphery, fighting for what they called the Northwest Territory, the Ohio country. So they actually recruited settlers. The settlers were Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish, and German. It was pretty much limited to that until the mid-century, 19th century. And this is when the Irish famine refugees came, a couple of million, very poor famine refugees, and Catholic, but they did speak English. So they were refugees, not immigrants. They didn't really want to leave their country. They were colonized by the British. But they were the first people who were not settlers who came in masses. And then they became kind of immigrants and then settlers as they were able to assimilate with the English language, and particularly by becoming a part of the police, becoming police. So it's a very interesting chapter. And then came the poor economic refugees from Southern Italy and Eastern Europe, also fleeing pogroms for the Jewish people who came. Most of them also very poor, but didn't speak English. So that was a real Americanization process that took place to really make them into settlers. And then it was cut off practically to only Western Europeans could come from 1924 to 1965. And very, very few documented immigrants were able to come, and almost no refugees during that time. There was strict quotas, which was really a great tragedy, really responsible for the deaths of many Jewish people who were not allowed into the United States. Cuba actually took more Jewish refugees than the United States.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I love that you brought up the assimilation part of it with Irish settler, the immigrants who came, and that makes so much sense. For you, Cesar, you examine, I mean, you cover a lot. Obviously, you go into very contemporary issues with border migration and the issues around that. But I love how you kind of start off pretty early discussing the impact of the Chinese Immigration Act and the subsequent increase in immigration laws that kind of stem from there. I was hoping you could give us a little context of that history.
Yeah, so we often think of, and thanks so much, Paula, for organizing this and for having me participate along with this wonderful group. It's quite an honor. But to get to your question, I think we often think of immigration law. We often hear of immigration law as something that is only present in the relatively recent future, but in reality, it goes back to a much earlier period in which certain themes that we see playing out in a very heated fashion, in a very public fashion these days, also occurred in an earlier version, and that is racism and xenophobia, the sort of sense of nativism that justifies the protection of some territory, some geographic territory, and as a result of which we're willing to penalize, criminalize, and potentially even put in put at risk of death other people. And in the late 19th century, the chosen undesirables of that era were Chinese migrants, beginning with a fear that women who were coming to the United States, or were seeking to come to the United States, were coming here as prostitutes. And so in 1875, we really launched what is often in immigration law academic communities thought of as the earliest moments of the modern federal immigration law framework that exists today. Really begins on the backs of Chinese women who are targeted by a law enacted by statute by Congress in 1875 called the Page Act, which was focused on really trying to keep out as many women as possible from China. And then in 1882, that broadened and under the guise of a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which did exactly what its name sounds like. It was really targeting people who were citizens of or descendants of Chinese citizens. And that eventually grows to include most of Asia. But one of the things that is quite remarkable about it is that there was no pretense that it was not just an openly racist law. Now, fast forward to the 1960s, and we have what is a relatively dramatic reorganizing of immigration law that happens through the Immigration Act of 1965, which is a law that we often think of as being a very liberalizing law. It comes sort of in the same moment as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of that period. But in many ways, the Immigration Act of 1965 actually does make migration to the United States much more possible for, in particular, people from Asian countries. But what happens with regard to the Western Hemisphere is it takes what had been a fairly limited number of restrictions on migration, and on the contrary, a lot of proactive efforts by the United States to actually entice people to come to the United States from Mexico in particular. The best example of this, of course, the Bracero program, that 20th century, enormous 20th century guest worker program, in which Mexicans were quite often exploited, used as inexpensive labor, and which is essentially the origins of my at least my mom's side of the family coming to the United States. But after 1965, we see that the same federal laws that make immigration more expansive for some folks actually makes it much more difficult for people from Latin America, and in particular Mexicans, and that's quite significant because, of course, in the moments before that, courtesy of the Bracero program, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans are coming every single year with the government's permission to work, and all of a sudden, that permission to work evaporates. It just dries up at the moment that the Bracero program is ended. And the thing is that the labor markets don't change, the interpersonal relationships that have developed don't change, the social networks, the social ties don't all of a sudden evaporate. The only thing that changes is now people are coming without the government's permission, i.e., through a series of policy changes. The federal government took migration that was lawful and just turned it into unlawful immigration. That is, just created an entire phenomenon of illegal migration by doing absolutely nothing except changing the legal framework by which migration that had been encouraged all of a sudden continued on, only now without the government's permission. And as a result, we see really strong enforcement response, primarily through the form of supporting more policing along the border, but also in the form of Border Patrol, INS, both formerly the Immigration and Naturalization Service, predecessor to today's ICE and Customs and Border Protection, but also through the form of prisons, and ramping up the federal government's ability to incarcerate people simply for the way in which they were migrating or are migrating to the United States, and that's a trend that we haven't shifted gears from.
Well, a common theme I'm picking up on here, and I guess it's no surprise. It seems like when the United States, and by United States I mean the white supremacists, when they have need for certain groups of people, they're fine with it. It's always tied into labor and economy. If it's benefiting them, you have Chinese labor for the gold rush and things like that. Obviously, Blacks being brought here as slaves to do the work that they couldn't do and that they didn't want to pay for the cotton and tobacco industries. And, you could go on. And it really, as you're saying, Cesar, with the, it was once okay for there to be a lot of immigration from Mexico and South America until it just wasn't. When they were doing something that they wanted, it was fine. And I mean, am I right in this thread that I'm seeing this theme?
I think you're certainly right, Paula. And one of the things that I think is important to point out is that the one you mentioned slaves, enslaved Africans, and the one explicit reference to migration in the U.S. Constitution is actually it is called the Migration Clause, and the Migration Clause actually has absolutely nothing to do with immigration in the way that we think of it today. It says it's actually just a bar on Congress's ability to ban migration prior to 1808. That is, it was a ban on Congress's ability to ban slavery. And as we think of migration as a more recent phenomenon, but actually it stretches back to the very origins of the foundational legal documents that to this day guide ordinary mundane decisions, but also serve that concretize the way that the U.S. legal system operates. And with that example and other examples that we could point to in the centuries since then, of course, we're talking about a group of people who are not only treated as undesirable and as exploitable, but at times their very humanity is put into question, if not outright denied, as was the case, obviously, in the form in the experience of people who were actually enslaved in that institution of chattel slavery. So we see certain versions of this come up over and over again. And the moment that we start questioning their humanity, then of course we could do whatever we want. We could ignore people if ignoring them is going to make it possible for them to get to the workforce that we want them to be in, or when it suits our interest, we can of course send sick horses on them in the way that we saw Border Patrol officers doing with Haitian migrants in the Texas border not too long ago.
Yeah. Those are all fabulous points. Syed, I want to bring you into this discussion because your book is great in reflecting the sameness and also the differences of experience for Muslim immigrants. And what I picked up was the thing that makes the difference is obviously the age that they are when they immigrate, but also what was going on in their country at that time. How much trauma had they been exposed to and getting away from? And two of your main characters came at a young age and hadn't gone through as much trauma as two or three others of your other main characters. So it kind of depends, was there a war going on? What was going on? But the thing that I see is this sameness is anybody post 9/11 seems to have very same experiences with how being treated by the US government and even just citizens, the way that they were viewed pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And I know you definitely bring that up in your book. And I was hoping that you could kind of tell us a little bit more about that. And feel free to tell me if I'm completely wrong.
Now, so before I answer the question, I just want to tell a quick story that came to mind as Roxanne was talking. There is an imam in the United States who I won't name, but he is married to a Native American woman who converted to Islam, so she takes the hijab. right? And she went to a grocery store and someone yelled at her, "Go back to where you came from," which is all kinds of ridiculous, right? But it just sort of shows the, it sort of drives home the I think what Roxanne would call a settler mentality, that we own this land now, and not sort of recognizing what was happened in the past. But to answer your question and to play off of what Cesar was talking about, I think U.S. citizenship for some of the characters in the Bad Muslim, I think for some people who live in these parts of the world where the interference of America has caused some horrible conditions to take place, has become a way to become more human, in the sense that the Western powers of the world treat their citizens and the lives of their citizens as more valuable than the lives of, let's say, people living in a village in Pakistan or Afghanistan, right? And so immigration to the United States becomes a way to sort of graduate in your humanity, to be counted, right? And so, for example, there was the hearing in Congress, it was ages ago, but about this young girl who came to Congress talking about her mom who'd been killed in drone strikes. And there were reports that over 200 children in Pakistan had been killed through US drone strikes, which no one talks about that. But there is this ability to, by becoming American, you become more human, which I think is sort of fascinating, and incredibly sad. I also think that we are able to be more hostile towards immigration now, setting aside the question of 9/11 really, because we're able to export our labor in a way we have never been able to do before, right? So whether you're exporting your IT needs or you're exporting the peeling and deveining of your shrimp, you don't need immigrants to come here to do that for you now. So it's easier for people who are anti-immigrant to say, we don't want you to come, because in a way, it allows you to separate yourself from the human cost of what your consumption is doing, right? I encourage the audience to go look at what a bag of peeled and deveined shrimp actually entails. There are people who are standing doing that all day, right? And they're doing them in awful conditions, but we never think about that because we never see it. And one of the reasons we never see it is because we value our lives and our experiences differently than those of others. And lastly, to the point of Muslim Americans in particular and 9/11, there's a section in my book where I talk about Afghanistan, and obviously it's been in the news recently for obvious reasons. But I only have 2 pages in the novel about it. I would recommend anyone who wants to sort of learn more about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the CIA, and the US role there. Stephen Cole's books, Ghost Wars and Directorate S, are really good resources for that. I'm sure they could get that through Book Passage. But we have this weird thing in America where no one else in the world says this, but Americans say this: we're leaders of the free world, right? We lead the free world. And then we take no responsibility for the world that we lead. And so a president comes into office and says, oh, the world is terrible, everything's horrible. But it's not our fault. Well, either you're leaders or you're not leaders, right? And I think one of the main problems with US immigration policy is the fact that it's isolated from other parts of US policy. The reason there is an Afghan refugee crisis right now is not immigration policy. Yes, there are immigration policy implications about how many people are going to get green cards and et cetera, et cetera. But this is a 30-year-old mess that the US created, starting with the Cold War and building through. So I think one of the problems with immigration policy is, especially for Muslim Americans, is it's treated as A, whatever's happening in your countries is not our fault, and B, sort of it's isolated from other parts of US policy, and I think that's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. What do you say to that, Roxanne? I mean, I know you talk about that a lot in your book, and we certainly heard a lot more of that in the last 5 years for obvious reasons. Do you have thoughts on that, Roxanne? Like, why do we keep having this repetition? It's been 30 years and we can't seem to get it right. It seems to get worse, or it's 2 steps forward, 10 steps back?
Well, I think, that first immigration law that was about exclusion is really the basic immigration and the Constitution itself. And, Alexander Hamilton in particular opposing immigration. Although in the musical, he's depicted as an immigrant, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But I think that one thing we have to realize that it's not just new with the wars in U.S. wars in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, but all along the wars that the United States make actually either creates refugees or creates conditions that make it impossible for people, like in Central America, the 1980s, devastated. I did work with refugees in Central America, and they've never been able to recover from it. And they installed these right-wing, corrupt governments that they keep in power and yet take no responsibility for it. And most of the public has no idea. So this creation of refugees that, for instance, in Afghanistan, in the last 20 years, millions of Afghanis have had to flee the wars. So 2 million of them in Iran, 1.5 million in Pakistan. Even Germany took 160,000. The United States took 46,000 Afghan refugees in the last 20 years. So there's no sense of responsibility for these wars. I mean, starting really with the war against Mexico, and creating that really disputed border. It's I don't know about Cesar, if he has looked at this as a lawyer too, but I think the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is an illegitimate treaty because it was a forced treaty, occupation of Mexico City, and a gun at the head, the government to sign the treaty. But anyway, it's certainly an unstable border, and and yet there's no responsibility for that. Mexicans are seen not as migrants who are following the crops and want to go back, but now, which they used to be able to do, but now they're cut off. They have to come and stay because they know they probably can't come back. So they have families. Many people have families dependent in Mexico, the Philippines, Africa. People who come to the United States send remittances back to to feed their families. So this, is it's really criminal behavior, and it's not going to change until people really understand that there is no U.S. immigration policy except exclusion and allowing certain people in. I think actually undocumented people are encouraged because of the policies, but they also are very contingent. They're not citizens. They pay taxes, but they don't receive any benefits. In California, we have some of our own laws, but so I think that it's intentional. The United States is built on, the settler colonialism is a capitalism that's really based on slave labor in the Cotton Kingdom. Mm-hmm. It's a very corrupt structure. just the structure of the United States, every institution, every law
Yeah.
it adds to it. And it really hasn't changed all that much structurally.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, I mean, I don't want to lose time and not bring it up to what's going on now. I mean, we had like this infusion of issues heightened during the Trump administration with the issues of border going on at the Mexican border, and then also as far as the Muslim ban, and just things that we didn't think we were going to see. I'm wondering if any of those surprised you, any of you. Did it go to a level that even shocked you, or did you see it as something like, no, it's just more of the same because they're not getting to the root of the issues? And also, Cesar, there seems to be this attitude of that it's criminal to seek asylum. And have we always had that attitude? It just perplexes me. Like, people seeking asylum aren't criminals just because they're seeking asylum. And a lot of times we've helped create the situation that they want to get out of, including in the Middle East and in South America and Mexico. So, and it got bad. It was really bad during Trump. I think Biden and Harris have inherited a lot, but I think they have legit criticism coming their way as well. So what do you think, Cesar?
Yeah, certainly. I think in some ways, President Trump, the person, and the Trump administration that he led were aberrational in terms of his, at least in recent memory, not in the entire history of the United States, but in recent memory, right? His explicit racism, his abrasiveness, his misogyny. I mean, the obviously we've had racist presidents in the past. We've had misogynist presidents in the past. His embrace of all of the worst features of humanity, I think in some way, yes, they are aberrational, at least in recent memory. But in many other ways, the reality is that his policies were building on those of his predecessors. The largest number of people who were imprisoned by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency came under President Obama until the Trump administration. That is, we had one record-breaking administration followed by another record-breaking administration. That doesn't sound to me like a departure from the past. That sounds to me like a trajectory. When we think of the number of people deported, the Obama administration still holds that record even after the Trump administration. And when it comes to the treatment of asylum seekers, people who were coming to the United States to request safe harbor in the early days of the pandemic in spring of 2020, the Trump administration initiated this Remain in Mexico policy, the migrant protection protocols, as they're formally known. In which we pushed people to wait outside of the United States while their asylum proceedings were ongoing. And at the same time, we tapped a decades-old public health law called Title 42, because that's the place where it sits in the federal laws, in which Border Patrol officers are just quickly expelling people from the United States, no matter what the reason is that they're coming here. And that's exactly the policy that was being used just in the last few weeks against Haitian migrants. And so and the Biden administration has had the opportunity to shift gears, to rescind that policy, and has never even said it was going to do so. On the campaign trail, President Biden never said he promised that he would rescind Title 42. And since taking office, he hasn't either. That is, the Biden administration is still implementing and still issuing statements about how important Title 42 is to their border policing policies. So we see that at least when it comes to the federal government's willingness to demonize migrants and to use really strong arm policing tactics to regulate the lives of migrants, This is something that has bipartisan support. We can look at the Carter administration launching the modern era of immigration imprisonment. We can look at the Bush administration in the 90s launching a policy of interdicting Haitians as they were trying to make their way into the United States while they're still on board, while they're still on the water. We can see the Clinton administration promising to rescind that while on the campaign trail and then getting into office. And being forced by a federal court to shut down a facility in Guantanamo, Cuba, that was opened under the Bush administration before him, but then getting around it and sending Haitian children there in the early 1990s. So these are policies that, they take on a different flavor from year to year, and at least in terms of the rhetoric, at times we do see some deviations, at least I think in President Trump. But in terms of the policies, we see a lot of similarities in the policies.
Is there anything for all of you, and especially you, Syed, just because I want to hear your voice again, do we have hope? I mean, Biden isn't a year in office, but we're already seeing like really big missteps, like with the whole rollout of bringing back, the troops from Afghanistan. It was just horrendous and shocking and poorly planned. Between that and, as you've brought up, Cesar, the Haitian policing, the policing of Haitian immigrants just recently, that's pretty bad within your first not even year. But is there hope between Biden and what he has said and Democrats claiming to have a commitment to passing inclusive immigration reform? Is there something for us to be hopeful for? I like to try to end on a hopeful note if it's possible. It's not always possible. And also, what can we do as far as the audience out there that's hearing that? Like, what can they do to help make change, be a part of change?
So you've invited a comic author to come and speak on a very serious subject.
I know.
And so what I'm about to say is going to sound... So what I'm going to say is going to sound like I'm trying to be funny, but I'm really not. I think that Cesar mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act and how it was a blatantly racist policy, right? And then we have the Muslim ban. But the thing is, it's not called the Muslim ban. In fact, Republicans were very clear it should not be called the Muslim ban, even though there were advisors of the presidents who drafted the document who said, he said to them, Muslim ban, find a way to make it happen, right? But we call it something else. And so if there has been progress, if you're looking for progress and hope, I would say that there is at least a insistence on a thin veneer of civilization over what are essentially the same policies. So in that sense, I think at least there has been some progress made.
Well, you're talking about semantics then.
Well, all of law, unfortunately, has become semantics. It was, I think it was Justice Leonard Hand who said, we place too much hope in courts and constitutions, and it's because, and we saw this in the war on terror, when we can change the narrative by switching words and what we call things, that's when we get into what we may call semantics, but these have, massive implications on people. So for example, whether it's going to be torture or enhanced interrogation, one's legal and one's not, they're the same thing, right? So I think we have a way of making ourselves feel better by making ourselves seem more civilized than we actually are in our policies, making them sound better and feel better, marketed better. I think that's the progress that's been made. I'm not sure it's a positive thing, but
Yeah, and I don't even know if I call that progress. I think one of your main characters in the book said, I think what would be progress is to really call things what they are.
Yes.
That way, at least you're dealing with truth on some level. And with that, I think I should bring Nick back in to see if we have questions from the audience, because I could go on, but we did open it up to audience members. So Nick, feel free to come back in and share some thoughts, comments, or questions from the audience.
Absolutely. I'm gonna be just my voice coming in from beyond, so I don't mess up my nice overlay. So we do have one, I think, rather large question from somebody that might take a second to answer. But an audience member asks, do any of you have any take on the skilled workers known as H-1B visa holders and how they are being treated in the hands of the USCIS? For instance, even living in this country for decades as taxpayers, they're treated as temporary. Their Indian children living in this country all their life are aging out at the age of 21. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I was a temporary worker for a long time. I worked on a TN visa. So, I don't have an H-1B comment, but I will say that from a larger perspective, I think, yes, that's problematic, and there's certainly problems there, but I would also state that on a bigger scale, the H-1B visa and skilled worker visas are also problematic for the countries that people are leaving. Because when I was growing up in Canada, there was this thing called the brain drain. There was the big brain drain to the States, but that's happening globally now, and that has serious repercussions. When we talk about how can we make immigration better, I think we need to talk about how can we make the places where people are leaving better. And if we take all the best minds, even if you're going to treat them terribly, their situations are going to be better here than they are back home, so they're more inclined to be here. I think that prevents the growth of societies that come from, but I think Roxanne wanted to say something as well.
Oh, well, I had, I live here, Silicon Valley's all around and in San Francisco. So I meet a lot of people who have the work visas. I think I think the brain drain is a principal problem on one hand, but also their contingency. They really don't have citizenship rights. I know Roxanne represents Silicon Valley, but and I think he really tries to represent those who don't have citizenship, but it's very difficult in the United States. They can lose that very easily. It's also used to prevent unionization. I worked at Fairchild in Silicon Valley back in the 1970s, and they purposely made more than 50% of the workers on these special visas. And we could never get a union because they just are unstable. You can't really expect them to do anything that would compromise their status. So I think it's even though they're paid fairly well, I think it's a exploitation that is really goes very deep. They can't put down roots. They can't really plan for the future, and they're needed in their own countries as well. So I agree with Syed that we need to pour just trillions of dollars into uplifting people around the world and paying reparations for the damage that's been done with climate change on the catastrophe on the horizon. We're going to have more and more climate refugees, and a lot of the ones from Central America now are in fact climate refugees, the droughts and so forth. And I really fear for the future if we don't have a massive movements here in the United States. I was encouraged when Trump was separating children, which is a practice that every president's done, but at least people rushed to the border, ordinary people. My neighbors, people rushed there to protest and to help. Organizations did, but it didn't last. That movement.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, the whole concept of the brain drain, how they're not, but I'm wondering though, do those immigrants have a quicker or easier path to citizenship? Or are you saying, no, they don't, no more so than unskilled labor from Mexico? Is that what I'm hearing?
No, they don't.
They don't, okay.
No.
Interesting, interesting. And Cesar, what about the Dreamers Daca? Where do we stand with that?
Yeah, sure. So the Biden administration just recently released a plan to adopt a more firm version of the DACA initiative, which is right now, it exists sort of as a series of policy memos, basically, and they're trying to formalize that. That's a slow process. That is a process that should have started a long time ago, like in late January of 2021, and frankly, it should have started under the Obama administration, but that didn't happen, obviously. But they're trying to move forward with that because DACA is still under attack in the federal courts, so it is very much at risk. But the reality is that DACA has always been and it continues to be a temporary reprieve. It is just a promise that we will stick you at the bottom of the list of enforcement priorities, and no more. And so those individuals, even if they obtain DACA, are always sitting around, subject to the executive grace, whatever the power is that be wanted to do. They're susceptible to that. And so until we actually legislate through Congress similar to more lasting option for these individuals to be able to stay in the United States, they are going to be susceptible. On the edges, yes, there's some creative maneuvers to some immigration lawyers try to help their individuals who have their clients who have received DACA to manage to turn that into a green card and then to citizenship eligibility, and those are fabulous examples of the potential impact of a creative advocate. But the reality is that lawyers are expensive. Many people don't have access to immigration lawyers, at least to especially to good immigration legal advice, and so that's a pretty piecemeal effort. And so without Congress actually legislating something that is going to take a broad approach to helping many of the people who are already in the United States and their family members, then I think we're going to be in a very similar situation in which these young people are going to be living in limbo.
Wow.
Cesar, just to go back real quick on something, since you'll know the answer to this. I don't want to leave anyone with the wrong impression. My understanding was that the H-1B could eventually become a green card, which you could then eventually use to get citizenship. Is that not accurate?
Yeah, well, it's a form of non-immigrant visa, and so you'd have to turn that into to somehow change your status into that of an immigrant visa, so into LPR status, into a green card before citizenship. So without the ability to convert that status, change that status into what's called a lawful permanent residency, then you are just here indefinitely, sort of in a time limited and specific time limited fashion for a specific reason. I will say the Trump administration tried to really change the policy on H-1Bs in the very last weeks of their time in the White House in January. And then I think it was just last month that a federal court struck that down as being illegal, but it was illegal on a really very narrow basis that really resulted from the Trump administration's incompetence. The problem was that the head of the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, was not actually the head. He was essentially pretending to be the head of DHS, but they had messed up the order of succession because they there are certain rules about who's next when the Secretary of Homeland Security resigns, and they just didn't follow the rules. And so, I mean, it's a kind of one of these like peculiar Trump administration incompetence reasons. So yeah, the court struck it down as illegal because if you're not actually the head, then you don't get to pretend, you don't get to have the powers of the head of the agency. But I wouldn't put too much purchase on that.
Wow. I really, I think this is just one of those situations where it's ongoing. It's a lot of more of the same. Obviously, people should still be aware of what's going on, maybe have conversations or letters to their representatives regarding bringing up certain laws or pushing through certain laws. But in other words, this wasn't billed as going to be a hopeful conversation, but more of just kind of, you know, we have to know. It makes you aware of what's going on, because you can't really have any impact for change if you don't even know what's going on. And I really appreciate what each of you have brought to this conversation. Clearly, I could have had a one-on-one for an hour with each of you on your respective fields, and one day I will, because I think this conversation deserves it. But I do love the dynamic of a panel and the questions you ask each other. Before we go, I do want Syed agreed to do a brief reading from his book, Bad Muslim Discount, that I thought was kind of appropriate to end before I do the final close of this event.
Okay, so yeah, one of the things is, you know, if you never give anyone citizenship, they'll never vote and they'll never have any political power. So you don't have to care about what they think or what their lives are like. So on that note, here's the thesis of the Bad Muslim Discount, which Paula picked out very astutely.
I gave you 2 options.
So here it is. It's part of growing up to realize that often, perhaps inevitably, we are left with incomplete stories about the lives of other people. It is impossible, therefore, to understand any other being as completely or incompletely as we understand ourselves. The best we can do is find some common ground in self-evident truths about how we are, if not the same, then at least similar. We can recognize that our experiences of the world, no matter how various and varied, how tinged with excess or want or joy or sorrow, make us all irredeemably, undeniably, irrepressibly human.
Thank you for that so much, Syed. I love that. Thank you, panelists, Cesar, Roxanne, Syed. And with that, thank you, audience, for coming and sharing this special conversation. Please do know that each of their books are available at Book Passage in Corte Madera and also in San Francisco, online or by the phone. And I encourage you to get their books and really immerse yourself in the topic. We just hit the high points. So thank you so much for coming and supporting this Book Passage event and more like it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roxanne.